Okay, next let's take a look at parts of your brain. Now, it's really not going to be fair to your brain because what we're going to kind of do is simplify some of these different parts of the brain to take a look at the anatomy and some of their functions. Now, all of these functions of the brain have a number of different, sometimes minor functions, but we're going to take a look at the major functions. Okay, so when you think about what part of my brain is doing this, then you think about, okay, well, this is it. So the first one you can see on your study guide then is called your thalamus. Thalamus. Okay. And a little later, we're going to be talking about the effects of drugs on the brain, the psychopharmacological effects. And that's why I have these two lectures together, so that we can talk about what's going on in the brain. At the same time, later on, when we talk about the different drugs, we can say, see, this drug can primarily affect this particular part of the brain. Can kind of see what's coming, right? So with this thing called the thalamus is an area in the middle part of your brain. And what happens is incoming messages come into the brain and get filtered, if you will, through the thalamus. So the thalamus then is kind of like a center that sends the information to the right part of the brain, to the correct part of the brain. Okay. So, for example, when you see something in your eyeball, that visual information goes through the thalamus, so it gets sent to the correct part of the brain back here, which is called your occipital lobe. Okay, so that visually, then you can, and at the same time, it's also sending messages here to your frontal lobes, so your brain can make sense out of information that you're seeing, just like you're seeing me now with the light waves coming into your eyeball. All of that's happening, instantaneously. Does that make sense? So the thalamus then is this part of our brain that helps send information, to the right place. I'll give you a hint. Later on, we're going to talk about something called lysergic acid diethylamide, okay? LSD. And so guess what LSD does? It scrambles the neurons in your thalamus. So when information comes into your thalamus, rather than going to the correct direction, it ends up going in another direction, okay? So think back on the old days when there used to be telephone operators sitting in front of this board with all of these wires, right? And a call would come in, and the information operator then would take it and plug it into the right place, right? Oh, here's another call. Plug it into the right place. And so in a way, we think of the telephone operator as being a thalamus. Information comes in, plug it into the right place. Now, if we then, give this operator LSD, well, guess what? Rather than plugging it in the correct place, plugs it in the wrong place. Well, what kind of problem would that cause? So, for example, people then who experience LSD report having something called synesthesia. Okay. Well, what is that? It means sort of a mixture of their sensory perception. So, people have reported that here they are on LSD, and they're and here's their speaker with music coming out of it, and they report that rather than hearing the music, which they do anyway, but in addition to that, they're seeing the music come out. One person reported that looking at their speakers as the music was coming out, they said it looked like toothpaste being squeezed out of their speakers. Synesthesia. So what normally should have been information coming in, which is auditory, what happened was that it got transferred to a visual sensation. Does that make sense? Okay. So that's thalamus. Got it? Information coming in, sorting it to the right place. Okay. What's next on your lecture guide here? Oh, I'm sorry, we jumped over thalamus. Let's talk about reticular formation. Reticular formation is also called reticular activating system. Sometimes you'll see it abbreviated RAS, reticular activating system, reticular formation, same thing, okay? Reticular formation is back here in the upper part of your spinal cord that attaches onto your brain. Sometimes you see in a movie, someone will go and hit some guy in the back and he, gets, and he hits the floor. That's because it's affected the neurons in the reticular formation. I've worked with people who've had traumatic brain injury. Don't do that. You don't want to give someone a traumatic brain injury. You don't want to receive a traumatic brain injury. So what goes on here? This function of the brain is largely responsible for what's called alertness and sleep, right? It's the part that when we're awake and alert and so on, are the neurons in our reticular formation then are firing normally, okay? As we go to sleep at night, then the neurons in our reticular formation begin decreasing in their messages. And so tonight, when you're putting your head on the pillow and thinking about psychology, of course, what I want you to do is say to yourself, okay, well, there goes my reticular formation, right? Boom. And so in cases where people have had a serious accident, a traumatic brain injury, or they've, their body has been in bad shape, they go into what's called unconscious state or in a coma. So what's the difference between sleep and a coma? Is in a coma you are unarousable. There's nothing we can do. We can try to send in stimulation that will try to activate the reticular formation, but in most cases the brain is going to take its time to heal so that the person finally can come out of a coma. Years ago, my dad had a massive stroke and he was in a coma for a month, and there was nothing we could do to arouse him. There he was, and he was looking just like he was sleeping, but his reticular the neurons in his reticular activating system were not able to fire properly. And then gradually, as his brain began to heal, he started coming out of the coma. I always thought, as in the movies, when someone would come out of a coma, they would, go like this. Oh, where have I been? What's happening? Oh, I've been in a coma, right? It's like, no, most people, because guess what? These neurons, in order for them to be reconnected again and come back to their normal function, take time to do it. So I remember my father, opened his eyes and we tried to talk to him, but he wasn't. And so for several days, he'd open his eyes and look around, but he wasn't responsive at all. And then as the days went on, pretty soon he was talking more, and pretty soon after another few weeks, then he was able to, more or less begin to understand what had happened to him. Got that? So reticular formation, or reticular activating system. All right, ready next to talk about the limbic system, which is in the inner core of your brain, okay? Sometimes called the reptilian part of our brain, the sort of basic part of our brain, okay? And so what goes on in the limbic system, again, in addition to a number of other things, is this appears to be where a lot of emotions arise. Okay, so when you're sad, when you're happy, when you're upset, when you're frustrated, and so on, a lot of this begins to emerge in the neurons that are in the limbic system. So when you think of limbic, think of emotion, right? And I'm going to go through these fairly quickly because this is also in your reading. Okay. Next is an area that is part of your limbic system called the amygdala. And so when you think of amygdala, think of aggression. They both start with the letter A. Okay? Think of anger. They all start with the letter A. And so what we find out is that when we do research with animals, and remember what that was called? Remember we talked about 10 different fields of psychology, and that one of the fields studied animals in order to understand human behavior. What was that called? Yeah, you remember that? Comparative psychology. Remember, comparative has the word rat right in there. Okay, so comparative psychology, what they've done is stimulated the limbic system, the amygdala part of the limbic system, and what do you get? Aggressive behavior. Normally, these nice, for example, white rats that I had to deal with, when I was a student at the UW, would be nice and peaceful, but when you stimulate those neurons in the amygdala, you get, aggression. So the next time you see someone get angry and aggressive, you go, "Oh, looks like your amygdala has been pretty stimulated, huh?" I'm sure they'll appreciate you for that. Okay, next we're going to talk about hypothalamus. Now think of that word hypo. We hear the word hyper, so what does that mean? Right, means above. What's hypo? Below. Heard of a hypodermic needle? Derma referring to skin, so a hypodermic needle is one that goes beneath the skin. Okay, so hypo means below. So when we think of hypothalamus in the brain, think of where that is. Yep, below the thalamus. But it is not related to the thalamus in any significant sense. It just happens to be located below the thalamus, hence hypothalamus. Now, hypothalamus has a number of functions like they all do, but the one that I want you to focus on is this is the area of our brain that interprets hunger, that gives you messages that you are hungry. For example, it's almost 2 o'clock right now, and I've been having so much fun with you that haven't had a chance to eat. So my hypothalamus is starting to send me messages like, hey, Dr. Bob, what are you doing, talking to your students? You should go out and have a nice peanut butter and jelly sandwich or something. So you got it? And so the more hungry you are, the more intense those messages are sent to your brain and the rest of your body, like, you better get something in there because, it's time to eat. So got it? Hypothalamus. And we know then that when we stimulate one area of the hypothalamus, we can convince people that or animals that they in fact are not hungry. But if we stimulate another area, that we can convince them that they're very much hungry. We know, for example, that when someone starts eating, that it takes about 20 minutes or so for their blood level to reach a level whereby it sends messages to our hypothalamus that we're not so hungry anymore. How many of you ever had this experience? You're hungry, you say, oh man. You finally sit down, you're eating some dinner, and it's so good, and then all of a sudden someone texts you or whatever. And you end up texting them and you end up doing it for 5-10 minutes or whatever. And you come back to your meal and it's like you're not quite as hungry as you used to be. Ever had that experience? That's because your hypothalamus has had time for, to get messages from your blood sugar that says, hey, I got some food in there. You don't have to send out those messages so intense anymore. Which says what? That when people want to reduce the amount of intake that they put as far as food, what do they tell people to do? Eat what? Eat slowly, right? What are they really saying? Eat slowly enough so eventually your hypothalamus, right, can get the message, because guess what? We can eat a lot in 10 minutes, right? But if you can slow it down, then guess what? You may not feel as hungry and then may not want to take that second or third or fifth helping, okay? Okay, so what are we talking about so far? We talked about the thalamus, the reticular formation, limbic system, amygdala, hypothalamus, and we're ready to talk about the last one, but this is the big one here. Cerebral cortex. Yeah, this area right in here, sometimes called your frontal cortex. And your cerebral cortex then is the area where thinking takes place, which is what you're doing right now, right? You're having a blast listening to this lecture, thinking about all this great information that you're learning, wondering to what extent you're going to remember. Oh, there's memory in there too on the upcoming exam. So this is where all thinking takes place, where memory takes place, where we take in information and we try to make sense out of it so later on we can pull out that information. We're going to talk later about, function of memory, function of forgetting, those kinds of factors that influence that, right? So what do we got? We got that the cerebral cortex is where our thinking takes place, and that when someone has a damaged cerebral cortex, that then makes it a challenge for them to have the kinds of thinking abilities that they had before. Like I mentioned, I worked with people for several years who had traumatic brain injury, and one of the things that happens is, boom, when their brain gets shaken and may even swell somewhat, then those axons sort of move away from the next set of dendrites, and therefore the synaptic gaps aren't able to fire like they normally do. And so that's why it's called traumatic brain injury. And that's why as time goes by, then some of those axons are able then to again, get close enough to the dendrites so that the synaptic message will be able to fire and move from one point to the next point. Make sense? So there they are, just a whirlwind tour of all the different, not all, just some of the different parts of the brain. And, like I say, we haven't done justice to your brain because it's much more complex than that. But this, for you, an introductory psychology student, will give you sort of a beginning understanding of the kinds of things that happen in our brain, okay? All right, next we're going to talk about addiction, and that's going to move us into we're going to talk about drug categories first, and then that's going to move us into addiction. So what I'm going to show you in a moment, I'm going to want you to draw this on your notes, and this is going to help you understand this area called psychopharmacology. It's a great one that you can use tonight at the dinner table while your hypothalamus is talking to you to shove food in your mouth. You can say to the people as you're eating dinner with, say, what do you think about the psychopharmacological effects of drugs on the body, okay, and on the brain? And they'll look at you and say, just pass the potatoes, don't give me that psychology stuff, right? So that's what I'm going to do. What I've done is develop this chart that I think is very helpful in helping us understand the effects of drugs on the brain. Drugs on the brain, and therefore in many cases on behavior and thinking and memory and those kinds of things, right? And so what we're going to take a look at are 7 drug categories. We're not talking about drugs that help with cancer or things like that. We're talking about psycho, there's the mind, pharma, and there's drugs, ology, psychopharmacology. Okay, so let's take a look at this chart that I've developed, and I want you to draw it, and then we're going to go through each of these. Okay,